Thank you, Carrie. Thank you, Paul. That was very nice. So our tour will start with RAMSA's first successful project in the area. I mean, I think Paul really gave the big introduction why we're doing this. But when we started doing these tours together and researching the building, I discovered there's a whole other narrative. And I thought it was really quite interesting. And I learned just things I just never knew about. And even though I work for Robert Stern, who's an expert in history, he doesn't know any of this either. So our first tour will start 15 Central Park West, which is one of our first buildings. We'll go around Columbus Circle, walk east across Central Park South, over the Grand Army Plaza, and finally ending at one of our other buildings, 520 Park Avenue. And along the way, you'll see notable examples of buildings constructed since 1900 that paved the way for today's upscale, high-rise residential projects. And you'll see various styles from Georgian, Romanesque, Venetian, and Chateauesque. And many of these have been adopted to a streamlined style mix of neoclassicism and Art Deco that I would describe as a distinctive style of New York City. So during the walk along the park, I'll talk about the history of 3 RAMSA projects and several unbuilt ones as well. Oh, okay. So most of these lectures you hear from Mark is really focused on the architects and the buildings they create. So my little story has a very different narrative. And it really focuses on the successes and the failures of many of these developers who built these iconic structures. So throughout the boom and bust cycles of the 1930s, the 1980s, and the 2000s, all sorts of New York characters have been endeavored to create their vision for Central Park South skyline. And if you look at, you might recognize some of these people, like the guy in the middle at the top. And the way you understand it, all the people in color are still alive, all the people in black and white are dead. So that clarifies that. So these developers just aren't merely sailing around in yachts and jet setting. They shoulder the immense risks associated with these projects. And so we have a history of larger-than-life developers whose fortunes rose and fell with great plans and even greater aspirations. So the lecture will explore the lives of the developers, interior designers, and socialites, and someone who lived the dark side of the American dream. And as Paul said, this whole part of the park is like, has all this history with the characters, conflicts, that really shaped New York City into what it is today. And they also shaped my office too. So 15 Central Park West. And this was a collaboration between Robert A.M. Stern Architects and one of the most prestigious development families in New York City, the Zeckendorfs. William Big Bill Zeckendorf. He was the grandfather and the founder of this dynasty. And he built a high-profile portfolio of properties and developments and businesses spanning North America throughout the 1940s and 1960s, including assembling the land that would later become the United Nations complex. But unfortunately, Big Bill had a habit of financing current projects by selling interest in future ones. And he wound up having to sell most of his properties to cover obligations in the 1960s. And then here we have his son, Bill Jr., and his grandsons, William and Arthur. And they continued the family business throughout Manhattan, but Bill Jr. was undone by the same problem that affected his father. Too many deals at once, slamming headfirst into a bad financial market at the end of the 1980s. So William and Arthur took a different approach. They focused on one building at a time to keep debt down and cash high. And they built buildings that were sort of a little bit pre-war styled apartment buildings. The Zeckendorf brothers acquired the Central Park West lot that was then occupied by the Mayflower Hotel, a 1920s Emery Roth design building. In the gripping one-round bid of $401 million, the brothers won the property in the spring of 2004, which was the highest price paid for a single acre at the time. And the design commission became a competition between RAMSA and Caesar Pelli. William and Arthur asked us to design a masonry building that responds to the architecture of Central Park West. They asked Caesar Pelli to design an all-glass building that references the buildings on Columbus Circle. So for inspiration for our building, we looked at 740 Park Avenue, which we will discuss later, and 10 45th Avenue. And what we loved about it was its abstract classicism, its restraint, and the crown of the building, which was asymmetrical and picturesque. So we designed 2 versions of the crown of our building. One was symmetrical, the other one was asymmetrical. and were concerned that the symmetrical version was pompous. We redesigned the building over the course of 24 hours, and we won the competition. So here we have the 35-story tower. It takes its place among the 1920s towers punctuating the Palisade, the Century, the Majestic, the San Remo, and the El Dorado, as well as many of the post-war towers that line the back range to Broadway. So here we have the crown of the building. Goldman Sachs hesitated to fund an all-limestone building, but as I remind you, our inspiration came from 740 Park Avenue and 1040 Fifth Avenue, both clad in limestone. Our primary goal was to bring the spirit of the Upper East Side elegant buildings to the Upper West Side by enveloping the structure in limestone. But most importantly, William and Arthur Zeckendorf wanted to bring the Upper East Side prices over to the Upper West Side. And then here we have the entrance from Central Park, which shows this restrained classicism, takes its inspiration from River House and 740 Park Avenue. Notice the cornices and the string courses are shallow. The French balconies further define the elevation. And here we have the main lobby, which references both Art Deco and also the columns from the Raleigh Hotel in Miami. And the paneling is inspired by Bruno Paul interiors. Bruno Paul was a German architect, the modernist, but also looked at Art Deco and Art Nouveau. And then on axis with the lobby is a pavilion, inspired by a garden pavilion at Sanssouci in Potsdam. And then the motor court has limestone walls, which contrast with the glassy walls of the Time Warner Center and Hearst Tower beyond. The reflecting pool in the courtyard, and it's also a skylight for the swimming pool below. And here is a photo of the penthouse of Sandy Weill, the interiors by RAMSA. So in 2011, the former chairman of Citigroup, Sandy Weill, decided to sell his 15 Central Park West penthouse to a Russian fertilizer oligarch who is in the middle of a divorce. To get the money out of Russia, he bought the penthouse for $88 million for his daughter, who was a student at the Harvard Extension School. The sum translated to $10,000 per square foot, the most ever paid for an apartment in New York City at the time. This sale told developers that the super talls and billionaires row were financially possible. So even though the building was completed just as the 2008 financial crisis hit, the sales broke records. And such was the demand, people were able to flip their apartments for much more than they bought them, even during the recession. The building, sometimes jokingly referred to as the Limestone Jesus, is now considered one of the most prestigious buildings in Manhattan. Even had its moment on the New York Times bestseller list. Michael Gross, the author of 740 Park Avenue, The Story of the Richest Apartment Building, also wrote a book about the development and the sales of 15 Central Park West, calling it The House of Outrageous Fortune, and it reached number 20 on the bestseller list. And now, we get on to Central Park West, known as Trump International Hotel and Tower. This is a project we were invited to work on, but ultimately did not for many reasons. I think a clash of brands is high on the list. So at the turn of the millennium, the buildings around Columbus Circle, the Gulf and Western Building, the New York Coliseum, and the Huntington Hartford Gallery of Modern Art were starting to show their age. And here we have the Gulf and Western Building by Stanley Thomas. It was full of asbestos, it twisted in wind, and is widely known as one of the ugliest skyscrapers in Manhattan. Donald J. Trump. In 1993, General Electric foreclosed the building and announced it would be converted to apartments developed by Donald. Donald's father owned a real estate firm in the outer boroughs that worked mainly for the middle class, but Donald wanted more. In the 1970s, New York City was literally in the dumps. There were trash strikes, and the city almost declared bankruptcy. And actually, Gerald Ford, the president of the United States, told New York City to drop dead. But there's one person who believed in the city, and that was actually Donald Trump. So Donald wanted to make a big impact in real estate and architecture, saying you must be in Manhattan to do this, not in the boroughs to do that. And he made his first big impact in Manhattan with the renovation of the Commodore Hotel on 42nd Street, cladding it in glass. And this was a precursor of his brand, slick, glassy, with a touch of gold. And here we have the Trump Tower by Der Scott, exemplified and promoted on this Vogue cover. This was the first ever design for a high-rise residential building. Our task was to reclad the Gulf and Western building while keeping the existing structure and massing. And pictured here are a few of our early concept drawings. The first one, a combination of Gothic masonry and glass. Number 2 was a glass building with implied structure. And number 3 was an Aldo Rossi-inspired grid. And then the last of her sketches, a stone facade with hints of Art Deco where the masonry dominates over the glass. And this was the beginning of a style for RAMSA. Donald Trump hated them all. So after getting the designs from RAMSA and Philip Johnson, Trump went with Johnson to get a building that looked like a combination of the Seagram Tower, Johnson's PPG building, but with gold glass. The simplicity of the building gives a hint of an Art Deco skyscraper through the verticality of its chevrons. The New York Times architectural critic, Herbert Moonshot, did not like what he saw as the symbolism of the building, writing a new Trump flagship sails in the troubled civic waters with the air of a casino, or at least the winnings of one. But Trump said in the Daily News, "Is this the top of the world or what?" Now moving on to what is now called Deutsche Bank, formerly the Time Warner Center. I prefer to call it the Time Warner Center. That's because of how I always knew it. So a long history predates the Time Warner Center at Columbus Circle, where the New York Coliseum by Leon and Lionel Levy stood from 1956 till it was demolished in 2000. Getting the Time Warner Center built, or anything on the site built, was a multi-decade process that had many roadblocks. In total, between 1985 and 2000, there were 23 proposals for the site. The decision to demolish New York Coliseum, when a Robert Moses lease-love project was made in 1984, and influenced by the Jacob Javits Center taking over its function, and the desire to capitalize on its prime location on Columbus Circle, and the parcel of land was put up for sale in 1985. The Metropolitan Authority took responsibility for managing the process. 13 proposals were turned in, the first deadline, May 2nd, 1985, with the aim of claiming the title of the highest skyscraper in the world for New York City. This is the Moshe Safdie design for Mortimer Zuckerman and Boston Properties, and it won the initial contest. However, once the public saw the towers and the proposed heights, opinion split over whether the tower would create too large a shadow over Central Park. Municipal groups and activists held protests under umbrellas in the park and filed lawsuits against the design, and the delays resulted in Safdie being booted from the project and replaced with David Childs of SOM. Childs came up with a step design of several 1930s style towers and a 5-story curved base. But nobody liked this. The city, developers, and the community kept on fighting until 1964, when Mortimer Zuckerman failed to meet a deadline and the deal was off. The project stalled until 1996, when the MTA held another call for proposals, receiving 9. The Municipal Art Society held an exhibition in 1997, which is the source of these images. And here you can see images from the exhibit. The city, the developers, and the critics kept arguing, but by 1998, the proposals were whittled down to 2. Donald Trump with RAMSA, Stephen Ross with SOM. Our design was a single tower on top of the podium, and this was the problem. The massing was given to us by the late architect Costas Kondelis, and Trump preferred this massing because he wanted to preserve an existing loading dock in the Coliseum so he could keep the retail open during construction. But most important, he wanted to move the tower away from the Trump International Tower to keep unobstructed views of the park. Stephen Ross, master of the universe, perched in the observation deck of his latest tower, 30 Hudson Yard. Ross was the winner of the competition. The Ross-backed SOM design had 2 obvious advantages. One, he came with a tenant for the building, the Time Warner Group. 2, the scale of the building was broken down to 2 towers, which appealed to both the city and municipal groups, and ultimately, I think, why we lost this competition with a single tower. A deal with Roth was made in 1988. The structure topped out in 2002. The final design had broad planes of tinted glass aligned diagonally with Broadway, but the glass made the building still seem darker, emphasizing the shadows, which did not escape the critics. The dot-com bubble of 2000 presented challenges for the sales, which were further exacerbated by 9/11, bringing the world to a standstill. And people really didn't want to live in Twin Towers and Central Park after this, which impacted the sales. And now we move on to a bit more diminutive, but just as controversial neighbor at 2 Columbus Circle. In 1964, billionaire Huntington Hartford opened his Gallery of Modern Art at 2 Columbus Circle, a project intended to serve as a counterweight to the Museum of Modern Art, which he had disagreements. George Huntington Hartford was born in 1911 and was heir to the A&P supermarket fortune. After graduating from Harvard, he worked briefly for his uncles at A&P, but they fired him. He was a bit incompetent. And then he pursued other business adventures. His life took unexpected turns. He also was dismissed from journalism for an ill-fated yacht trip. He also experienced a naval hap in World War II. He ran a ship aground. He mistook feet for phantoms. And after the war, he established himself as a playboy and cultural connoisseur in California, beginning with several initiatives. They included a colony for artists and writers designed by Lloyd Wright, Frank Lloyd Wright's son, and the establishment of Hollywood's first stage theater. Both are gone now. Paradise Island, his most extravagant expenditure, an island in the Bahamas, which he developed at the cost of $30 million. And as part of this project, he acquired and installed a complete 12th century monastery bought from William Randolph Hearst. Unfortunately, a drug habit stemming from his fourth wife, Elaine, led to his downfall. He withdrew from society. He was evicted from his Beekman Place apartment. And he eventually settled down in the dilapidated townhouse on East 30th Street. And ultimately, he lost the townhouse. He went bankrupt, losing nearly $1 billion in today's currency. But back in happier times, the 1950s and 1960s, Huntington Hartford wanted to make an artistic statement with the design of his museum. The first concept for the gallery was designed by MIT student Hanford Yang. The concept was an 11-story building with interlocking concrete cylinders sheathed in plastic. Ultimately, Edward Rellstone designed a 10-story building that enveloped the site and released the drawings in 1959. The facade is clad in Vermont marble. The walls of this Venetian-inspired vertical palazzo were with perforated portholes at the corners, base, and crown, inspired by a Romanesque church in Paris. This heavily referential design was meant to reflect Hartford's taste for representational art as opposed to MoMA's abstraction. The critics were not receptive, however. The New York Times architecture critic Ada Louise Huxtable came up with the description, "It looks like a die-cut Venetian palazzo on lollipops." As mixed as the response to the architecture was, the museum's reception was worse, and Hartford eventually lost the building. And despite protests and lawsuits by conservation groups and architects, including our founder, Robert A.M. to preserve the building, Edward Rellstone 1964 Gallery of Modern Art was significantly altered by 2008. Brad Clofield of Allied Works reclad the facade with terracotta, and he included little 4-inch slits and 3-inch channels winding around the building. While Huxtable approved of the renovation, many did not. So Huntington Hartford's last trace was erased. He lost his fortune and legacy of buildings. He simply wanted to be taken seriously, but he was a hostage to fortune. The Gainsborough Studios at 222 Central Park South. Many early 20th century duplex apartment building cooperatives were built with double-height studios for artists to live and work. The building was designed by Charles W. Buckman. It was 16 stories and constructed between 1907 and 1908. The building is named after the English painter Thomas Gainsborough. The artist Auguste Frazen, who was the founding president of Gainsborough Studios, influenced the decision to name the building after Gainsborough. The Gainsborough's facade is considered the most distinguished of the studio buildings, and the bas-reliefs and the bust of Thomas Gainsborough are above an Ionic portal. Frazen also hired sculptor Isidore Conte, and the frieze by Isidore Conte depicts individuals bringing gifts to the altar of the arts. The top of the building is decorated with Moravian tile, which is used in New York City structures such as the Bronx Zoo. The studios have 18-foot ceilings, and the double-height windows marked it as an artist building, and the apartments quickly became popular with a wider audience. A building underwent restoration in the 1980s and was designated a landmark in 1988. And now we come to the RAMSA's second project, 220 Central Park South. A building like 15 Central Park West, but combines an 18-story villa with a 950-foot tower behind it. Stephen Roth. This is actually a cartoon from the real deal. It was drawn during COVID. So Steve Roth is the founder of Vornado, the largest commercial real estate owner in New York City. And after seeing the sales of the Zeckendorf building around the block, he came to RAMSA and said he wanted to build 15 Central Park West on steroids. So during the final months of construction, COVID brought the economy to a crawl, but Steve called his stockholders and reminded them that Vornado is loaded after the successful sales at 220 Central Park South. And today we're back in the office more than ever. Manhattan's on the rebound, and I think the Vornado stock almost tripled since then. So Stephen Roth assembled the site for 220 Central Park South, a story which could be its own lecture, a tangle of complicated deals and negotiations with Gary Barnett, who built the Central Park Tower behind the RAMSA Tower. Many of Steve's executives, advisors, wanted him to hire an architect like B.R. Ingalls or Zaha Hadid, but Steve had a vision and hired Robert A.M. architects and just told his advisors to go away. So here we have both the tower, which has a tower in the villa, which has a strong presence on the skyline, and they join the family of buildings that frame Central Park for generations. And the villa sits comfortably among its neighbors, such as the Gainsborough, which you can see in the image, and then the super tall Central Park Tower behind it, constructed by Extel. The setback in the building is the largest terrace on the property. The crown of the building is an extravaganza of setbacks and double-height living rooms, something only Rosario Candela and Emery Roth could dream of. And then we have the grand ballroom with its double-height living rooms and the German nickel gates going to the motor court on 58th Street. And the finish is inspired by the doors from 740 Park Avenue. For inspiration, we looked at the French metalworker Gilbert Polarot, who worked in the 1930s and 1940s and was very well known for his furniture, and our door is on the left. But on a sad note, the lobby designed by interior designer Terry Despont, who died age 75, August 2023. In 2019, the hedge fund manager Ken Griffin purchased full 4 floors of the building, including the terrace, for $238 million, the most expensive residential sale in the United States, and Steve was right to ignore his advisors. And now, we move on to the hotels of Central Park South, beginning with Essex House. Before Essex House and Hampshire House were constructed, they sat in the land that was originally the Central Park Apartments. The Spanish developer Jose Francisco de Navarro tried to build an 8-building cooperative designed as a single massive apartment building known as the Spanish Flats. They were possibly the largest housing project in the world in the 1880s. Ultimately, the buildings arrived in the market during the Depression of 1882, some foreshadowing. The buildings were sold in auction, 1888 unfinished, and were demolished to make way for the hotels and the New York Athletic Club in 1926. Prohibition had a major impact on Central Park South. The hotels in the area had to adapt to safe solvent. Many were not successful, particularly due to changes brought by prohibition. Speakeasies and private dinners replaced ballrooms as social drinking spaces. Hotels with ballrooms such as the Plaza suffered. And then came the Great Depression of 1929, which marked an important turning point. One could buy the American dream for just 10% down, but this was no longer possible. The stock market lost 89% of its value, leading to widespread despair, individuals tragically taking their own lives. The Depression resulted in 1 in 4 Americans losing their jobs. This was the new reality. The design of Essex House was drastically simplified by the time it opened in 1930, reflecting the economic conditions of the time. So here we have Essex House, a tower rising from a symmetrical base. There was so little architectural rhetoric in the design, so little in fact, the hotel erected a huge sign on the roof to identify itself. It was one of the last hotels to go up before the Great Depression, and the constructed design was much simpler than originally planned, a symptom of the financial times of the 1930s. Literary critic Louis Mumford applauded the accidental restraint, saying this is downright architectural nudism, but only the architectural dressmakers have any reason to complain if such nudism becomes fashionable. What ornament is on the building could be described as machine-age deco, a break from the more classical and opulent neighbors. Dorothy Draper. She was one of the few icons of old New York that made a successful transition into the modern era. Growing up in the first in the gated community in America, Tuxedo Park, she was born into the lap of luxury, but for when a life of leisure, became one of the most famous interior designers of her time. Instead of higher education, she married another member of the New York social scene, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's doctor, spent her time raising her children and lavishly decorating their homes. This continued for several years until Mr. Draper decided to divorce. Dorothy took this in stride, leaned into her work as interior designer, and founded a firm developing a bold, distinctive style, which you can see in publications and projects around the United States. So if the exterior of Essex House was new, the interior was not. Draper was hired to provide interior decorating for the public spaces of Essex House. As gaudy as this space is here, it's but an introduction to the garden room. The manager of Essex House held the same position at Hampshire House next door, and having worked with her before, sought to convert the extra spaces to new function rooms. And he said the garden was busy most of the time, and the amount of repeat business was astounding. And sadly, the garden room, as well as the other Draper interiors of Essex House, no longer exist, a victim of progress. Hampshire House. Strange circumstances surrounded the completion of Hampshire House and revived the old spirit of the hotels of the 1930s at the end of the Depression. Dedicated to yesterday's charm and tomorrow's convenience, I was walking across the park and I saw this cornerstone by accident, and I realized this cornerstone succinctly sums up the ethos of the house. Hampshire House was abandoned in 1931 and finished when the developer defaulted on the loan. It stood derelict until 1938, when the trustees had to figure out a way to make money from the property, so they hired Dorothy Draper to furnish the building, and the hotel quickly became a hot spot for New York City socialites. Dorothy Hale, a tragic socialite. Hale was an aspiring actress who came to New York City in the roaring 1920s, searching for success. She landed a role in Lady Be Good on Broadway with Fred Astaire. She married sculptor Gardner Hale in the late 1920s, but he committed suicide by driving off a cliff in California in 1931. At this point, Dorothy Hale had passed the age of 30. She was too old to keep on working as a dancer. A friend of hers loaned her $1,000 to buy a dress and to catch a rich man. She started a romance with Harry Hopkins. He was the architect, President Roosevelt's advisor, and the architect for the New Deal. Anticipating a White House wedding, she moved into Hampshire House, but he broke off the engagement several months later. On October 20th, 1938, she held a farewell party, telling such glamorous guests as Prince del Drago of Italy and the editor of Vogue, Margaret Case, that she was going on a long trip. She went to the theater to see Oscar Wilde. Returning from the play at 1:15 a.m., she threw herself out the window. Her close friend, Clara Booth Luce, commissioned Frida Kahlo to create this remembrance portrait of her. The painting captures the glamour and the pathos of Hampshire House. Executed in white brick, Hampshire House is a strange hybrid, a cascade of setbacks attached to a rectangular tower that rose from the back lot. The tower is crowned with a steep copper roof and twin chimneys. The architects, Kahi and Evans, wanted to create a balance between traditional and modern architecture. The New York Times described it as an adaptation of Georgian, which you can see in the old homes in the county of Hampshire, England. Draper festooned the rooms with daring contrast of black and white, turquoise, and envisioned the building as a traditional London townhouse with a garden, fountain, and a pool. And she also used overscale plaster carvings and door moldings of cast glass. And she created a garden theme room called the Fountain Room, which became one of New York City's well-known party rooms. Draper's interiors are mostly still intact today. The St. Moritz Hotel, designed by noted architect Emery Roth. Roth Emery Roth, like Rosario Candela, designed many of the great apartment houses in New York City, and his work can be seen prominently on Central Park West. And his story is the American dream. Coming from a Jewish background in Hungary, when he was 14 years old, he found himself cleaning an architect's office for a few hours a week. The job turned into an apprenticeship. And then Roth later worked in the office of Burnham Root for planning the World's Columbian Exposition. And while working on the exposition, he encountered famed architect Richard Morris Hunt. Then he moved to New York and became one of the most prolific architects of the building boom of the 20th century. At the end of the 1920s, Emery Roth, along with Thomas Hastings, designed the Ritz Tower. This was his big break, proved influential both for its height and clever use of setbacks. And its influence could be seen on the Schultze Weaver hotels we'll examine later. After the Ritz came commissions for the Warwick, the Beverly, and the Oliver Cromwell hotels, and the Beresford and San Remo apartment buildings. But the Great Depression tanked their value to pennies on the dollar, and Emery Roth's name is forever etched into the Central Park skyline. So from 1929 to 1930, Emery Roth prepared plans for the St. Moritz, and named after the picturesque upscale Swiss skiing town. The building rises 38 stories, has 1,000 rooms, and was meant to be a moderately priced apartment hotel. The lobby also had a painting of St. Moritz, which has now been lost to progress. Asymmetrical setbacks above the 21st floor culminate in a square tower with a pyramidal roof rendered in red tile. The design was described by a contemporary writer as a picturesque cliff among the towering trees of the north and south. In 1997, RAMSA was contacted by Donald Trump to convert the hotel into condominiums. The existing Roth plan had smaller hotel rooms, and the new design had living rooms, primary bedrooms, and libraries facing the park, which need larger windows than the existing windows. Donald originally wanted to remove the facade and clad the building in glass, just as he'd done at the Gulf and Western building. Robert Stern agreed it would be impossible to fit larger windows into the existing facade, so it would be necessary to remove the existing facade and clad it with masonry. Alas, there was a problem with their design. Even though the building was not landmarked, the St. Moritz was much beloved, and many people thought the original facade should be preserved. And most important, Amanda Burden, who served in the New York City Planning Commission. So ultimately, our design was blocked. Donald Trump fired us and sold the hotel to Ian Traeger. But for this RAMSA, this is the beginning of a new important design direction, which would define 15 Central Park West, 220 Central Park South, and many others. And I would call it modern classicism. So to develop this modern classicism approach, we spent a lot of time studying 740 Park Avenue, a building by Rosario Candela. And as the building steps at the sky, the apartments become larger with expansive terraces. It's clad in limestone, and the plans are quite complicated and integrated in the massing, fully becoming mansions in the clouds. The DNA of the building is something of a Rosetta Stone for RAMSA. And notice at the base of the building, the first two floors are fluted, the stone frames, window frames are subtracted from the fluting, and above the second floor, there are shallow pilasters with linen fold details. The string courses and cornices are shallow and abstract. The front doors are German nickel. While the building has many classical references, its style is a fresh interpretation of classical and deco, which has not been seen before. The Plaza began in 1883 as a family apartment. Here's our early concept drawing by Carlo Pfeiffer, but as usual, the builders had financial problems. The New York Life Insurance Company foreclosed on the mortgage, and then they hired McKinley & White to transform the half-built structure into a luxury hotel. And despite initial praise, by 1905, the building was outdated. And then with the recovery of the economy at the turn of the century, the building had to be torn down again, and then the new one was built, which is the current plaza that we see now. Henry Hardenberg was the architect, but most important, the hotel was built one of the great and underappreciated characters of New York City development, Harry Black. I'm sure many people have never heard of him. He was a real-life Citizen Kane, and he lived the dark side of the American dream. Harry Black was a surveyor and wool salesman from Ontario who married construction magnate George Fuller's daughter in the 1890s, took over his father-in-law's business, the Skyscraper Trust, which became the largest construction and development firm in the United States. The firm's portfolio included the Plaza, Macy's department store, Pennsylvania Station, and the Fuller Building, later known as the Flatiron Building. However, the firm's work declined in the 1920s. He became embroiled in various scandals, both matrimonial and otherwise. In 1929, Black was found unconscious in his bathtub at the Plaza. Emergency crews worked on him for hours. He eventually regained consciousness. The newspapers the next day described this as just as an accident. 5 days later, the stock market crashed. Several months later, he shot his brains out at his estate in Long Island. The Plaza's location at Central Park and Fifth Avenue contributed to its distinction, but the architecture elevated it to one of the leading hotels of the time and became the go-to event place for many dignitaries, heads of states, and celebrities. The Black and White Ball, hosted by Truman Capote, was possibly the greatest event held at the Plaza. It took place November 28, 1966, thrown several months after the success of his first nonfiction novel, In Cold Blood. The ball was held in honor of the Washington Post publisher, Katharine Graham, whose husband had just committed suicide. This was really just an opportunity for Truman Capote to throw a party befitting his high society friends he made and wrote about. He was the ultimate social climber, and ever since his literary success made him a celebrity, the ball represented the pinnacle of his success. The party was the who's who of the New York socialite scene, and the guest list included Andy Warhol, Gloria Vanderbilt, Harry Belafonte, Frank Sinatra, and Mia Farrow, to name a few. But also in attendance was Amanda Burden, seen on the right in this photo. She would later become the commissioner of buildings in New York City, and she played a role in blocking RAMSA's design for the San Moritz Hotel one block over 3 decades later, and I had no idea she was so glamorous. So the Plaza changed hands several times over the decades, finally landing in the hands of Donald J. Trump in 1988. He had always wanted to own the Plaza and been trying to buy it since 1975. And then here we have Ivana Trump, his first wife, in front of the Plaza. She was the manager of the Plaza, and Donald paid her $1 a year and all the dresses she could buy. However, both his fortunes and marriage to Ivana fell apart in the crash of the early 1990s, and he lost the Plaza as well. His last attempt to save the hotel failed when Walter Kwok, one of the most important Asian real estate investors at the time, was sealed in the hotel room, the Harry Black Suite, by a swollen door. They had to chop the door down to get him out. He announced the hotel was too old to renovate. When the news was relayed to Donald Trump at Trump Tower, he ran over the Plaza in a rage and started firing the people, both the employees and the guests. Mickey Naftali, our client for 200 East 83rd, the Belmont and Henry, and many other projects, was with LAD in the 1990s. And he actually tried to buy the Mayflower Hotel and build a 15 Central Park West, but it didn't happen. So, looking up at the Mayflower Hotel, sad, he walks across Central Park, looks up at the Plaza and says, okay, we'll buy the Plaza Hotel. And the Plaza Hotel became a competition between 15 Central Park West, and 15 Central Park West ended up winning in the long run. So after the Plaza lost, Mickey Naftali realized the value of RAMSA and resulted in him hiring us for many projects. So if the Plaza was the grandest hotel on Central Park South, it has 2 compatriots across Fifth Avenue, the Sherry-Netherland and the Pierre, and they can hold their own architecturally and socially. And we'll begin with the Sherry-Netherland and its namesake, Louis Sherry. Louis Sherry, born in Vermont in 1855, began his career in upscale hospitality. He opened his first restaurant and had to upgrade twice, moving to Fifth Avenue, adding a dance floor in the process. His name was synonymous with the highest level of service, and the hotel's brochure boasted, the Sherry-Netherland tradition is drilled into every member of the personnel. And this explains why the Sherry-Netherland Hotel bears his name. But Mr. Sherry died the year before the building went up. The fire of 1927 the night a hotel turned into a torch. While the tower was under construction, a fire broke out in the wooden scaffolding after hours and quickly enveloped the upper building into flames. The standpipes were not functional yet. The fire department pumps could not get up that high, so there was no choice but to watch the building burn out, which some chose to do in style, renting rooms at the plaza to watch. And here we have the Sherry-Netherland with its silhouette imposing from Central Park. The building's setbacks allowed for spacious terraces beginning at the 18th floor. And then above the 24th floor, there are simplexes and then duplexes at the top. And then here we have the hotel's high-peaked roof, adorned with a then gilded lantern, a stylistic nod to the Plaza Hotel to the south. It also has other French elements, such as gargoyles jutting out below the eaves, and a bayed Romanesque window arches set into the gables. The Sherry-Netherland was built on land that was previously occupied by the great mansions of the 19th century, and the ornament reflected this history. Sculpted panels from the Vanderbilt Mansion, demolished in 1926, can be seen in the lobby. Those are the medallions. Sherry built an impressive store at the corner of 62nd Street in Madison by McKean and White, and has also been the inspiration for many of our buildings. His chocolate brand is still in business, keeping a bit of the Gilded Age alive, and that's what you saw in the front, where we had the Sherry-Netherland chocolate. The Pierre, the building's namesake, Charles Pierre Casalasco, was a busboy from Corsica. He wanted more, and he learned cuisine in Paris at the turn of the century, where he met Louis Sherry. In the 1910s, Charles Pierre came to New York to work for Sherry, whose employment he stayed for 10 years. At that point, frustrated with the conservatively styled and managed Sherry, Charles Pierre opened his own restaurant, which resulted in a high-class clientele. The clients turned to partners, and they built the Pierre Hotel in 1929. The irony is, he built a more expensive hotel next to his former boss's hotel using the same architects, but the Great Depression came for Pierre just as it did for everyone else, and Charles Pierre lost the Pierre. The Schulze-Weaver design building is a graceful expression of its time, reflecting a more domestic heritage with its copper-sheathed mansard roof, a memory of the great mansions it replaced. The exterior decoration leans into English and colonial Georgian architecture in contrast to the French buildings to the south. It has ornate dormer windows and wreath urns set into the roof and terraces, further highlighting its classicism. The robbery. On January 2nd, 1972, 3 members of the Lucchese crime family, Sammy Nilo, Bobby Comfort, Nick the Cat, along with 5 accomplices, executed a daring heist. Arriving in a black Cadillac at 4 a.m., they used a fake reservation to gain access to the building. Once inside, they stole $27 million from the safe deposit boxes. Although the robbers initially got away, their freedom was short-lived. Comfort and Nilo ended up in prison. The others in the heist were murdered, and Nick the Cat is now in the Witness Protection Program. And now we arrive at 520 Park Avenue. And finally, after many bankruptcies, 2 suicides, a fire, a robbery, jail, and 1 president, we arrive at 520 Park Avenue and the Sun King's William Arthur Zeckendorf. After the success of 15 Central Park West, 18 Gramercy Park, they hired us again to design 520 Park Avenue. 520 Park Avenue has 35 apartments and its 54-story tower, and it joins the Sherry-Netherland and the Pierre at the southeast corner of the park, a stone needle in the sky, just like the Pierre and the Sherry-Netherland. The building is crowned by 4 corner chimneys, framing pilasters and edifices, with a copper roof limestone pavilion at the 48th floor. And the changes in the fenestration break down the building's height and express different apartment plans. The bay windows in the east, north, and south emphasize the verticality of the tower. And above the 39th floor, we have balconies that overlook the preserved views of the Upper East Side Historic District. The massing and detailing of the base respect its neighbors, the Goyer Club and Christ Church, and each of the facade of the building is further detailed, evoking the great New York City apartment houses of the 1920s and 1930s. And in the building entrance, a double-height arched doorway with a suspended bronze canopy and leads into a vestibule with a coffered lobby and a marble fireplace. References to the Sun King appear throughout. The rays of the sun emanate from a glass orb above the front door, and it's also, you can see it in the lobby desk. The interiors are the most opulent of all our residential high-rises. Cerulean marble that was used at Versailles can be seen throughout the lobby. And on the walls, the salon facing the garden. The trellis work in the garden is also inspired by Sanssouci at Potsdam, a reference we used for 15 Central Park West. And here we have Robert Stern, William and Arthur Zeckendorf in front of the reception desk, and you could see the sun motif from the Sun Kings set into the paneling again. And finally, our own Horatio Alger's story. The son of a cab driver, his mother worked in a department store, became a star architect and the dean of Yale School of Architecture. Robert Stern always envisioned Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers dancing on a terrace overlooking Central Park. And I always found this collage of him quite beguiling. So in this image, which I love, it's from the movie Follow the Fleet. And here you see Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. In this scene, Fred Astaire was just in a casino. He lost all his money, and he goes up to the roof to have a smoke. And he sees Ginger Rogers, and Ginger Rogers is about ready to jump off on the roof of the building because she's in total despair. And then Fred grabs her, and he starts singing, "Let's Face the Music and Dance." So on stage each night, Robert Stern looks down the drain, "Let's all entertain my American dream." That's it.